said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened. You will be as gods, knowing good and evil.'" Genesis 3. "O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord." Ezekiel 17 or 27. So here we go. Valentin Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot, Letter 13, Death. And so Tomberg, in this his discussion of death, what do we mean by death? What is death? And by this he enters into a meditation on what he calls the three types of death, or forgetting, sleep, and then physical death. So what is forgetting? Forgetting is something disappears from your awareness. And as he says here, natural forgetting reduces man to animality. And natural sleep reduces him to vegetality. And natural death reduces him to minerality. So what's implied here are they're called the kingdoms of nature. So there's the mineral kingdom, the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, and above them all, the human kingdom, right? And then there are angels above that, etc. But also, what's implied here is reference to the sheaths that, according to esoteric thinking, medieval thinking in particular, which wasn't esoteric then, which all people possess, which we share with the kingdoms of nature. So with the kingdom of the mineral kingdom, we share the physical body, right? With the plant kingdom, we share the physical body and the etheric body. With the animal kingdom, we share the physical body, the etheric body, and the astral body. And what we possess that they don't possess is the ego. And so then he says, natural forgetting reduces man to animality. So that means in natural forgetting, the ego, the self, gets removed from the process or the existence of memory. And then with the natural sleep, reduces him to vegetality. So when we're asleep, our astral bodies and egos kind of separate from the etheric and physical bodies, and so we're like plants. we have being and life, but not a whole lot of movement. And then natural death reduces the human being to minerality, right? To just what's physical in our chemical constitution, which quickly degenerates into compost. Okay. Now, and he says on page 344, these kinds of death, these stages of death, we could even call them, that it is necessary to subtract the self or the ego from the astral body, the etheric body, and the physical body in order to understand the mechanism of forgetting. It is necessary to subtract the self and the astral body, as I just suggested, from the etheric body and the physical body in order to obtain the state of sleep. It is necessary to subtract the self, the astral body, and the etheric body from the physical body in order to obtain the corpse, that is the fact of death. Right? And then he asks us, which I think is a very wonderful moment in this meditation, if, can we just not engage in all the stuff we've read about or heard about death and engage in a meditative work? This is on page 344 as well. To think directly about the subject which occupies us, without the intermediary of what may be borrowed from sources other than our immediate experience and understanding. This is phenomenology. He's asking us to do a phenomenological reduction of death. To examine these things, by bracketing, putting to the side our preconceptions or what we've seen on the History Channel or read in Nature magazine about what these states are, and to just examine the phenomena itself, or as Edmund Husserl would say, return to the things themselves. Right? Now, so what's memory? And what is forgetting? Now, there are all kinds of things that we forget. And he does, we'll get to it in a bit, talk about automatic memory. If we had to remember everything, it would be kind of a little taxing. But what is memory? So I want to invite you to do a little exercise. So you can close your eyes if you want. And I want you to kind of just relax. And I want you to try to conjure up your earliest memory from when you were a child. What is the earliest thing you can remember? And as you're conjuring that up, pay attention to what the event was. Try to recall how old you probably were. It's sometimes not so easy. But try to recall it. Where you were. What the occasion was. And also, importantly, from what vantage point do you see this memory in your soul, in your mind's eye? Now you're looking through your own eyes. Are you watching yourself from a certain angle? So just let that sit for a second. Now, so when you recall this memory, typically people's first memories are someplace between the age of 2.5 and 4, usually right around 3. And why is that? For one thing, why does memory kick in there? And some people, Rudolf Steiner, for instance, suggest that that's when the ego becomes present, in the physical body. But here's my other question, and this always fascinates me. I've done this exercise with college students, with school kids in middle school. From what angle or what vantage point do you see this memory? Most people, depending on how old they were in the memory, say that usually if they're about 3 or 2.5 to 4, like I said, if they see this very often, more often than not, they see this memory as if they're looking down and just behind themselves, their younger self, right? They can't see the face of the younger self, but they can see the back. Now, why is that? I don't have an exact explanation, so don't look for one. But I suspect it has something to do with the stage of incarnation at which you were when you were at that age. How close was the ego to the body? Just a little outside of the body, it seems. And interesting for especially people who remember as children, and they recall this memory as looking through their own eyes. What does that say about their state of incarnation? Were they too incarnated at that point? Well, if they were 3, for instance, probably. I don't know. I don't know the answer, but it's worth thinking about. And it certainly is fascinating that more often than not, it's from over here someplace. And the other thing I should say with this, very often what intrudes upon the evocation of this memory is our experience of photographs of ourselves when we were little kids. You know, so if that's the case, right? So the photograph, what is it? It's an external memory, right? It takes the place of a memory, and it's interesting that now we don't have it now because we have digital cameras, but in the when I was a kid in the early days of photography, you know, we photography was reliant on silver, you know, silver derivatives, and silver in occultism, as you know, is the planet of the moon and the planet of reflection. So I thought there's certainly an alchemical connection right there. And so to return to Tomberg on page 345, he continues. He says, memory is the magic in the subjective domain which affects the evocation of things from the past, which you just did. It renders past things present. The present remembrance is the result of a magical operation in the subjective domain, where one has succeeded in evoking from the black void of forgetfulness a living image from the past. Is it imprint, symbol, copy, phantom? And he says, it is all of these at once. So kind of interesting, right? Because we don't carry all of our memories present to us all the time. And some things we actually do forget. I often run into things that I don't remember, people that I must have met when I was younger. I just don't remember them sometimes. Other times, it seems I remember things that nobody else remembers. People I know who were there and had this, were part of this, what I took to be a significant moment in my history, and I'll bring it up to them. They have no recollection of that happening. So it's interesting, isn't it? And so from here, Tomberg moves to what he calls the 4 types of memory: mechanical or automatic memory, logical memory, moral memory, and vertical or revelatory memory. Now, mechanical or automatic memory just happens. You don't have to work at it. You don't have to try to. It's not something where you retrieve. It just happens. And you could also, I think this happens with what we call muscle memory, too. It's not something you have to try to recall. It just comes back. So, and it's you know, in a way, it's a godsend that it doesn't. I mean, if for playing a musical instrument, for instance, not too long ago, I got together with, well, it was a while ago now, but after 25 years, I got together with some of my old friends to play some music together, and we hadn't played that long, but the songs came right back because it was all right in the muscle memory, and we didn't have to think about it. It just returned, right? So that's kind of mechanical memory, something that just automatic. But then logical memory, right, which we just engaged in your first memory exercise, that's logical memory. We had to retrieve that and kind of reconstruct it. You know, how old was I? Where was this again? You know, who was there? That's you're using your intellect to reconstruct that. And there's like Tomberg says, there's a little bit more automation in that memory than there is in moral memory. When moral memory, he says, is no longer something which happened, but rather is an authentic magical act, although subjective. It is love which is at work in moral memory when it recalls things from the past. Here it is admiration, respect, friendship, gratitude, affection, and 1,000 other things which have deeply moved you, which render things from the past unforgettable. Right? That is evocable at each instant. You know, so for me, what would I moral memory? definitely falling in love with my wife is a moral memory. The moment, I can tell you the moment. I won't, but I could describe the moment I knew I was in love with my wife. Right, hit me like a bolt of lightning. And it hit us both kind of by surprise. We were friends until then. But interestingly, other things you would think would be part of my moral memory, the birth of my children, I don't remember this. And I was present for the birth of all but one. All but two were born at home, and I almost delivered a few of them because the midwife was kind of running a little bit late. But I don't remember the moment when they came out. I think I even caught one or two of them. I think the midwife had me catch the baby as my two youngest girls came out. I don't remember that. I remember telling that. What I do remember is when my eldest daughter was born. Right after she was born, when I went out of our bedroom into the living room, where I was, to tell my mother-in-law that I was laughing and crying at the same time. It's kind of a important moment in my moral memory. But I don't remember the actual instances when the children came out. And I don't even necessarily, except for a couple, I have 9, remember what time of day it was. For a couple I do, but for others I have to reconfigure it or ask my wife for some details. Then it comes back. So I move into intellectual memory with those. And he doesn't touch on vertical memory quite yet, but he does have a pretty bold statement. A couple, and this is on page 346. He says, people who are able to and who know how to give everything a moral worth and to see a moral sense in everything will not forget anything. They will have a normal, if not excellent, memory to a very advanced age. And he says, moral memory, which can comprehend everything without exception, is all the more effective the less one is morally indifferent. Indifference, a lack of moral interest, is the fundamental cause of the lapse of memory, which often takes place in old age. It's interesting. Especially when Tom Berg wrote these words in the 60s, there were certainly people who had what we now call Alzheimer's or dementia, but probably not at the kind of epidemic levels we have now. I wonder what he would say about that. Is it, and how that would figure in to what his statements here. Indifference, a lack of moral interest, is the fundamental cause of the lapse of memory, which often takes place in old age. Of course, I also think what we see in dementia and Alzheimer's now is really a product of all the chemicals and preservatives that were introduced into Western diets in the last century, last half a century, or last 70 years, I guess we could say, which has horrible consequences, I think. But then he talks about vertical or revelatory memory. He says, and this is exactly what it says, bottom of page 346. It is a memory which does not link the present to the past on the plane of physical, psychic, and intellectual life, but which links the plane of ordinary consciousness to planes or states of consciousnesses higher than that of ordinary consciousness. It is the faculty of the lower self to reproduce the experience and knowledge of the higher self, or if you like, the faculty of the higher self to imprint its experience and knowledge upon the consciousness of the lower self. It is the link between the higher I and the lower I which renders us authentically religious and wise, and immune to the assaults of skepticism, materialism, and determinism. This also, which is the source of certainty not only of God and the spiritual world with its hierarchical entities, but also of the immortality of our being in reincarnation, wherever it is a matter of reincarnation. Right? And he continues on the next page, 347. Vertical memory is the more effective to the extent that the three sacred vows, obedience, poverty, and chastity, render the lower man capable of listening to, perceiving, and receiving things from above without distortion. Vertical memory is fundamentally only moral memory carried in its development to a still higher degree. This is why it is only moral purification, which the practice of the three sacred vows entails, that counts in the case of vertical memory. Intellectual interests such do not count here. Now, wow, this is something to think about. Now, I have a story for you. Another story. Now, a friend of my wife's, this is, gosh, it's probably 15 years ago. She was in her son was not feeling well. She picked him up from school. He's probably 7 years old or so. And so she had him take off his seatbelt and lie down in the back seat of the car. They were only about a mile from home. And as they were on their way from home, a semi hit them. A semi ran on the wrong side of the road and had a head-on collision with them. And the little boy, I don't know if he went through the windshield or what happened, but he was severely hurt, and he was in a coma for a while. But when he woke up, and this is, I have to preface this, but my wife's friend was not a religious person at all. I kind of thought religion was all bunk and dismissive of any kind of spiritual claims like that. But when the little boy woke up, he wanted to go back to that place. So apparently he had an experience of the spiritual world. He wanted to go back there, and he told his mother all about it, which made her reconsider her position. Now, I don't know what's happened with this boy in the meantime. He's probably about 24 now, 23, 24. But it would be interesting to find out, But nevertheless, I think this is an example in a way of vertical memory. This is not something that happened on the horizontal plane with this boy. It happened elsewhere. And of course, what Tomberg's describing here as vertical memory has a relationship to what Plato's idea of anamnesia, right? Which is the recalling of things from our sojourns in the spiritual world, and not learning. This idea that we don't learn anything, we just remember things. We remember things from the spiritual world. That's a bit of what Tomberg's touching on here, and this is why Plato believed in reincarnation. Tomberg is upholding reincarnation. But even though he says right here, and he'll talk more about it in a little bit, that it's reincarnation wherever it is a matter of reincarnation, and it's important because people make, as I said before, people make too big of a deal out of reincarnation, and it's almost better to not even think about reincarnation because of the stupidity that's spread about it, right? Pardon me. And then he gets into the raising of Lazarus, right? Here, and for Tomberg, there are these stages in this operation of raising Lazarus. First, the recall to life comprises 3 stages: that of coming, that of taking away the stone, and that of recall, crying with a loud voice. Right? First, to come and arrive is the activity which seeks and finds the last door which separates the recaller from the recalled. Right? There's a movement. Then taking away the stone, this is the effort which vanquishes doubt, depression, fatigue, and lastly despair, which bar the way to the recalled. He says, this doubt and lack of faith paralyzes the effort to recall and is like the stone placed before the tomb. This stone is often, if not always, the cause for many people of the absence of all living feeling and conviction, without speaking of precise and concrete remembrances of former lives, that is, of reincarnation. Right? And the last, he says, is to cry with a loud voice is the culminating and the supreme effort of the operation of recall through the force of love. So what Tomberg's doing here in his discussion of Lazarus and the raising of Lazarus is he's giving an example of vertical memory in its highest form, which is what he says. And it's not anything to do with reincarnation. It's with recalling one to life. You know, I think a great example of this actually is the same story is from Crime and Punishment, in Dostoevsky's novel Crime and Punishment, where the main character Raskolnikov commits this crime of this, killing this kind of repugnant woman, he felt justified in killing her because he was the great man. He was a Nietzschean Ubermensch, and she was just some nothing. But as his guilt captures him, and he meets this woman Sonia, which Russian for Sophia, don't let it fool you. Eventually it just eats away at him, his guilt, and he runs into her room and begs her to read the raising of Lazarus to him, because this is the condition of his soul. He's dead, even though he's walking. He knows he's spiritually dead, and he needs someone to remove the stone and call him forth. And it's her role in the book, and it's being interesting to do, which I don't have time to do at the moment, to do a sociological reading of Crime and Punishment. But that's Tomberg's emphasis here, is the calling to life. This is memory, right? And Raskolnikov is recalling who he was created to be. In that instance, he was not the self-created man of Nietzsche. He was called to who he was meant to be, and he heard that call, right? And it is a miracle, right? And Tomberg continues on page 349. He says, "A voice is louder that is more audible in the physical world, the more intense the vibrations are that it produces in the air. It is otherwise in the spiritual world. There, a voice is more audible, that is louder, the more it expresses underlying effort and suffering." Right? And then he points to why, and this is why the rosary is such an exemplary prayer, And he even says kind of a startling, I shouldn't say startling, but powerful statement. He said, "I would lack respect for the truth if I did not say that the effort of the rosary prayer founded on suffering makes it a powerful means, sometimes almost all-powerful, in sacred magic." There's another reason to say the rosary right there. Right? And then he continues this discussion of its miraculousness, and he says, "There is no freedom outside of the miraculous, in that man is man only insofar as he lives from the miracle, through the miracle, and for the miracle," which means to get away from the mechanical memory, the mechanical automation of life, that we have really, gosh, if he could have lived to see the internet, he would have been, I'm sure he is right now, kind of horrified at what we see. Because the automatic is the realm of slavery, and freedom, the realm of moral imagination and the vertical imagination, is where the miraculous lives. And it's not like where the miraculous lives; it's where we can participate in the miraculous and make the miraculous a reality. Which is sacred magic, right? And here he discusses this on page 350. I'll read it to you. "It is only the functioning of the human machine when a rich man declares himself anti-communist and a poor man declares himself pro-communist. But it is a miracle, that is to say, an act of freedom, when a rich man abandons his possessions and embraces poverty, as did St. Anthony the Great and so many other saints." Right? The miracle of St. Francis is not only the healing of a leper, but also the love of St. Francis for Lady Poverty. Right? Did not the miracles of Jesus Christ after the resurrection of Lazarus culminate in the cross on Calvary, where, in the full agony of torture, he said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do"? Right? And he continues, This does not just happen, it is done, it is created. And I repeat, one only does miracles, and all that is done is a miracle, and nothing is done without it being a miracle. All that which is not a miracle is not really done. It happens as a part of automatic functioning. And it's only through the miracle that true being expresses itself, that the creative word is revealed. Right? So that takes an act of will to, we've talked before, to be open to grace in order that that can happen, in order to the vertical imagination and the vertical memory. Right? And then he talks about the mission that we have. One can speak of a mission or an election, and rightly, because such a mission is the only one that truly exists. For the true mission, this is on page 353, is not what the human being proposes to do on earth according to his taste, his interests, and even his ideals, but rather what God wants him to do. Arbitrary missions, although due to the best intentions in the world, have only contributed confusion to human history. It is to these inopportune missions that we owe many crises, upsetting the life of mankind's living traditions, interrupting in the guise of passing comets the peaceful and constructive flow of true progress. A true mission on the earth serves the cause of the ennoblement and spiritualization of that which is, that is, of what lives as tradition. It brings an impulse effecting the rejuvenation, intensification of tradition. And furthermore, page 354, a true mission brings to greater perfection everything human on the earth. And listen to what he says: the family, civilization, culture, religion, and so forth. Whilst arbitrary missions can result in summoning the intervention of Martians or Venusians so that they rule affairs on earth. Yeah, I mean, so think about this. Think about this. I mean, we live in an age where people are on a lot of missions, a lot of different kinds of missions out there to change society or to change the family or to change whatever they're going to change. Now, this is what Tom Berg would say. Are those missions a product of vertical memory? Or are those missions a part of the life which the serpent promises? The immortality which the serpent promises to Eve? You know, it's something worth thinking about. And of course, this speaks directly to the role of Hermeticism as this agency which seeks to be not even open and aware, but to fructify, the church and tradition by vigilantly maintaining that openness to the spiritual world, or to the vertical dimension, to grace. And then Tom Berg talks about ghosts, which where else are you going to put it in but in a chapter on death. So what is a ghost? And he says ghosts exist. This is not a question of belief, it's a matter of fact. And it is. I don't know if you've experienced ghosts. We have, my family, many times. Oh my goodness. It's not like we're Ghostbusters or anything, but we lived in a couple haunted houses, and this is when my wife and I were first married, had our first couple children, and there was a room in this house we were renting, and where we had our kids sleeping. Our two boys, they're now 29 and 26. They were 5 and 2 at the time, and they came out of the room one time and said, "Can you tell that lady to leave us alone?" That was the woman who died in their house. And so Tom Berg provides us with his kind of criteria of what a ghost is and what you can do about it. And it's on page 359. 1. A ghost is an entity made up of psychophysiological electrical energy with an inferior consciousness in comparison with that of a normal human person. The consciousness which is revealed by the actions of a ghost, by its way of acting in general, is very limited and extremely specialized. One is tempted to characterize it as maniacal, since it manifests itself as the crystallization of a single passion, a single habit, or a single fixed idea. It's true. And then he talks about, the energy, this electrical energy of the ghost. And talks about ways of dispelling it or freeing it from this condition. Because, the way he thinks about it, the soul of the person is not totally free while this ghost is hanging around. When this ghost has not been dispelled, either through rituals of the church, holy water, right, or exorcism. And I don't mean like a demonic exorcism. I mean just kind of a house blessing exorcism. And he says, which I find, and he gives you that one example of clasping in and breathing in the ghost, which I would not try. But he says if you do that, you'll feel an electrical charge as the ghost is dispelled. And then he says that the ghost is not the soul of the departed one, and that it is a burden to him, being bound to the soul of the departed by a heavy link of responsibility. And he says that if you do this, after the dissipation of the ghost's electrical energy through its reception into oneself, the departed one hastens to make acknowledgement of his gratitude by means of a very vivid and clear dream for his deliverance from this heavy burden. And I have to think Tom Berg did this at least once, right? And he compares this, he says this, and he gave the example earlier from Gurdjieff, which I don't want to get into, of this is Gurdjieff's astral body, which is built up by the physical body. It's not the real astral body, as we were talking earlier. It's a, and Tom Berg connects that building up business to the Tower of Babel. And then, kind of drawing from this idea of the ghost, and he talks about the psychoelectrical double, almost like a golem. He talks about this on 360. Now, I want to bring something to your attention. Now, I've mentioned before that one of the things, I would love to talk to Tom Berg about is, what do you think of the internet? What do you think of social media? And here's what he says on page 360. And this actually speaks to what's going on right now in our cultural moment. And the same thing happens with human beings who are possessed by strong desires, passions, and intentions. Can be achieved methodically by making use of the scientific method of the construction of the Tower of Babel. Then one could not only animate the double crystallized from a desire, a passion, or a dominant intention, but also equip it with an intellectual apparatus of very developed functioning in mechanical memory, in which all the facts of experience on the physical plane are accumulated. The self of such an occultist would then be allied to this double, who is the bearer of his memory and intellect, and could incarnate himself anew, avoiding purgatory and the whole path of purification, illumination, and union, which is the lot of the human soul after death. And he says this is another kind of immortality, right? Now, I don't know if you probably are familiar with some of the projects of the transhumanist movement, right? Now, I don't know if they'll be able to accomplish this, but this is what some of them would like to accomplish. Is Ray Kurzweil is one of them, right? Who they would like to find a way to upload our memories into a computer chip, and then as our physical body deteriorates, clone it, create a new body, find a new body, and download the memories in this computer chip into this new body. Or even it could just, some of them suggest just having a virtual existence, so Your virtual existence doesn't take place in the physical body in biology, but in a computer environment, a kind of electronic environment. Is that not what Tomberg is talking about here, right? This is the promise, or rather, the program of the serpent. And it kind of horrifies me that some people just think this is the greatest idea ever. Even some ostensibly, Christian or Catholic people think it's such a cool thing. Yeah, we could do that. That's evolution. Yeah, that's the devil, right? And as Tomberg quotes here from Genesis, "You will not die if you eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil." Right? It's the construction of the Tower of Babel. Kind of disturbing. I have to take a second. Now, yeah, so that's definitely worth thinking about and warning people about. In fact, in my work in my academic work as a professor, I have been talking about this topic with students for at least a decade, maybe 15 years. We'll look at movies like Blade Runner or Ex Machina or 2001, and just to get them to think about where we're going with our technological civilization, and they kind of don't get it. I'm surprised that very few of them are alarmed. I even showed them there's a documentary on Ray Kurzweil and his transhumanist project called Transcendent Man. And I showed them that. They just, yeah, they're fine. They've grown up with iPhones in their faces all the time. And they just don't see what the big deal is. And that's another thing that is the anti-sophiology. It's taking us away from nature, taking us away from biology, taking us away from reality. And it's dangerous. And I feel one of my primary missions, and we're talking about mission again, is really to bring that to awareness. And sometimes I wonder how I'm doing a very good job at all, because it seems it's such an uphill struggle. And so anyway, to move back to Tomberg and to move along a little bit in his discussion, he talks then about reincarnation again. And and I think, as I mentioned before, I'm not anti-reincarnation or the idea of reincarnation, and I certainly have feelings and intuitions about my own relationship to the past. But, as I also said, I've kind of decided to take a breather on talking about reincarnation too much, because I hear so many stupid things said about it, and I hear it often seems like an excuse for bad behavior. I guess I just have karma, amongst other things. But at 361, Tomberg is talking about, the Tower of Babel. How a way to avoid purgatory, which is a way to avoid the three stages of purification and union, preparation, purification, and union. And he says, or you see now, dear unknown friend, why the church was hostile to the doctrine of reincarnation, although the fact of repeated incarnations was known. And of course, probably the primary biblical proof is, when Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And one says, "Elijah." And truly I say to you, Elijah was already here. It's John the Baptist, right? But he says, and it could not remain unknown to a large number of people faithful to the church with authentic spiritual experience. The deeper reason is the danger of reincarnation by way of the ghost, where one avoids the path of purification in purgatory, illumination, and celestial union. For humanity could succumb to the temptation of preparing for a future terrestrial life instead of preparing for purgatory and heaven during earthly life. right? Which is the transhumanist project now. So it's almost like El Diablo found another path. I mean, so say for the people who don't have a spiritual path at all, they don't have reincarnation's not their interest, because they're not even spiritual but not religious. They're just nothing. But now the devil can get them this other way through technology, better living through technology, right? And which also is another way to avoid the stages of purification, illumination, and celestial union. By, talk about the myth of the eternal return, but it never ends, right? You just change clothing and you can retain your consciousness. Almost like a vampire movie. What was that movie? I always used to get really psychically disturbed by vampire movies, but because of this idea of living forever at the expense as a kind of parasite, it just disturbs me. And of course, you ever see the movie what's it called, The Hunger, with Catherine Deneuve and David Bowie? The part where David Bowie's character all of a sudden ages overnight, and he's just dispensable, and the main vampire, keeps going. And that's kind of the same idea. There's no purification, illumination, and union in that lifestyle. In that mythos, we could call it. And there's none with transhumanism, and there's none with some ways that people try to practice reincarnation or try to think about reincarnation. Right. So that's, so what Tomberg's saying here is death is important. Just like the death, forgetting is important. You should forget a lot of things. You can recall them later. You should sleep. That kind of forgetting. You need sleep. You need to have forgetting. And you need physical death. Right? Remember, it's not a door that closes, it's one that opens and you walk through. And so the final thing I want to say, what Tomberg says about reincarnation here in 362, he says, "I implore you, therefore, dear unknown friend, to have the goodwill to examine, in the light of moral conscience, the question whether the way of treating reincarnation in esoteric teaching that has been adopted and is practiced in general, both by representatives of the French occult movement of the 19th and 20th centuries, and by theosophists, anthroposophists, Rosicrucians, etc., is justified and desirable." My answer is that it's not. And this, I told you, I rejected this a long time ago, even though I've rejected that way of thinking about reincarnation a long time ago, and probably prompted by Tomberg, right? And he finishes finally. "I may add that in the last analysis, it is a matter not only of the moral danger of evading purgatory and the experience of eternity, but also of replacing one immortality by another, namely that of God by that of the serpent. For our two deaths and two immortalities." And remember, the devil is the ape of God. So he can't really do immortality. So he'll do an ersatz immortality. And then, I don't want to talk about it too much, but he, you can see in his discussion of Descartes and Kant that he's trying to give them respect that's due to them and due to their method, even though he doesn't necessarily approve, but he's giving them respect for coming to their conclusions, and he compares them to some forms of yoga, And both Descartes and Kant, they did not reject God outright. In fact, at Descartes' third meditation, it ends with a prayer. So they weren't anti-God, but what they did is they just kind of set in motion kind of rotten developments by people who were their inferiors, who took up what they said in a kind of incomplete manner and turned it into something it wasn't. Actually, I think that's the same thing that happened with Jacques Derrida and deconstruction. Deconstruction is a very valuable thing, but the way it's been employed in academia by people who are just not up to Jacques Derrida's moral and intellectual quality kind of ruined it for everybody else, and it's become just kind of adolescent cynicism. It's kind of a drag. And then let me see, he moves along, and he repeats a lot of things we've heard earlier, so I don't want to really go over them all. But notice what he does, though, is he recapitulates regularly the ideas of mysticism, gnosis, sacred magic, and hermeticism. He revisits them in the letter on death toward the end, in the last several pages, as an example of that open circle again, right? And but then he ends in a very strange place. I think I had to think about this every time I've read this. I had to sit with this last page, on page 370, when he's talking about the hands, feet, and head that are sticking above the ground in the card, right? And he talks about death acts as the guardian of a determined level and cuts off every member of the human body which appears above this level. It acts as a surgeon rather than an exterminator. But what kind of surgeon is it? And he doesn't really give a big explanation here, right? And he intimates it. He says it's about the method and ideal where one makes electrical energy ascend after having animated and intellectualized it from the physical organism to higher planes. And then death cuts it off when it reaches into the etheric plane, right? Like, you can't come up here. And sometimes it is only electric hands which succeed in ascending to the vital or etheric plane. Sometimes it is the feet, and sometimes it is only the head. Right? Grasping and intellectualization, I think we could say. Now, death on our card sees to it that the vital world is not invaded by emissaries from the physical world. It cuts off, as a true surgeon, the electrical members of the physical body which appear above the level, which is the threshold of the two worlds, where the realm of the vital world begins, the etheric world. So, and I guess we could probably tie this, and maybe he was anticipating what would happen with the internet. Because you think about the internet and social media and this idea with transhumanism, these are all realms that exist in an electronic sphere. I mean, what is it? I mean, talk about reality. We have an experience of beauty in the sunset or something, right? So something is disclosed to us. So we find Sophia, we find the splendor of God shining through nature. So we're connected to that. But or if we find a poem or whatever, things that are real, they disclose themselves. What is disclosed in these electronic environments? I think it's worth thinking about. And I think part of what he's describing here is almost like a spiritual, it's like, and he talks about St. Michael earlier, almost a kind of spiritual guardian at the threshold, which death is. So maybe one side of death is St. Michael, is that when humanity, through these the electrical current of the serpent, rises into this etheric, which is the lowest of the spiritual planes, it gets cut off. And you could think that the sword, or the scythe of death, is, in another permutation, the sword of St. Michael. So it gets cut off to prevent, it's prevent bad things from happening, but you don't belong here, is the main thing. And he ends, he says, death is certainly the principle of surgery in the world. It affects the amputation of members that become unusable, even the totality of unusable members, that is the whole physical body, so as to free the whole human being. So in a way, I think this is true. I mean, Tomberg is anticipating transhumanism in this letter, without having such a, without even being conceptual when he was around. No one knew this would happen, but he intuits it, and for that, I think we owe him a lot of respect. Right? Death corresponds to surgery in the cosmic hospital. And I think for us, postmodern Christian Hermeticists, it might be part of our task is to, we have a strong, incredible task, because we have a much stronger current of the serpent awake in this electronic environment, and how can we find a way to open the vertical dimension to grace, and to make ourselves available to grace again. And next time we talk about temperance, well, it's a rest area between death and the devil. We'll have time to contemplate that. So see you then.